When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the person who was paralyzed, "My child, your sins are forgiven." I was the paralyzed man. I was given no name, but I would like to tell you my story just the same. I was lying on my mat like any other day, and folks were talking about this healer who had come to town to stay. By then, I was used to being left on my own, a freak, a pariah, someone best left alone. I would hear people whisper just above the din, "That guy was surely punished for some unspeakable sin. That's why the guy was stricken in that way. Don't you see? I don't want to get too close. Could spread to me." I was used to that talk. By that time, it ceased to trouble the least of my worries and the least of my struggles. Just then, some friends appeared, hovering above me the way they always treated me. I knew they clearly loved me. They said, "We're on our way to see this new rabbi who's in town, and we're darned if we're going to leave you here just lying on the ground. Who knows? This Jesus fellow might be the one to heal you. So if your family doesn't mind, our plan is just to steal you. We'll bring you to the house he's at. Let's see what he can do. If it comes to nothing, we're just out an hour or two." I objected. You know, when people see me, they're going to start to shout. They'll say, "Don't bring that guy in here." They'll all be freaking out. They replied, "As though we care what those people do or say. We love you, and we hate to see you suffering this way." I really had no choice. I was used to going with the flow. No agency, ability to choose which way to go. And I was touched by the faith they had in me, the faith they had in each other. They didn't see me as some paralytic. They just saw me as their brother. All was well until we saw the crowded house Christ lived in, people spilling out the door. We asked, but no one wanted to give in or make some room for one like me whom they blamed for my condition. No matter what my friends would say, we couldn't gain admission. "No problem," said one friend, who spied a stairway up the side leading to the roof. They weren't going to be denied. What happened next is just a blur. I can't clearly recall. The next thing I knew, they were hard at work digging a big hole in that roof, despite the shouts and yells that came up from the room as people dodged the mud and straw that fell down with a boom. Just one person chuckling with a smile upon his face as my friends next lowered me on my pallet to that space. This Jesus turned to me and said, "Your friends, it's moving to see the faith they have in you and the faith they have in me, and in the God who longs for all to be healthy, well, and whole. But I'm going to ask them before they go to fix that crazy hole. Through them, I see that God has forgiven any sin you might have done, to show such courage and such love to one the others shun." Some scribes who stood along the wall found that statement so disturbing. They grumbled, "To say that to this guy who's obviously undeserving." But Jesus told me, "Let the faith your friends displayed in helping you give you confidence, courage, strength to try the things you cannot do." And sure enough, though I know not how, when he told me to arise, I somehow found that I could stand and walk, to my surprise. I do not think each friend alone would ever dare to do the things they did that day as much as each one cared. Together, though, they found the faith that comes in community and breached the wall of callousness with their importunity. I know full well each friend alone would never ever dare to do that crazy thing they did as much as each one cared. Together, though, they found the faith that lives in community to breach the wall of callousness with that importunity. There are three things to learn from this story, I think, and now we've heard it 3 times. First, faith is something you can see. Faith is something you can see. It's visible. Second, faith is something communal, something we find together in community. And third, our faith can elicit a divine response, and that can move mountains. Okay, faith is something you can see. Did you notice how in the story, Mark tells us that Jesus saw their faith? He didn't hear about it, he saw their faith. What a curious phrase when we're used to thinking about faith as something we feel inside, something we believe, something we maybe talk about. But faith, according to the gospel, is something you do. And therefore, it is made visible. That makes more sense when you see that the word for faith in the Greek of the New Testament, pistin, means trust or confidence. Andrea pointed out in this week's Bible study how embedded in the culture of the time was this idea that disease and infirmities were caused by sin, by some sort of moral failure, a moral failure that then could rub off in proximity. So what courage it must have taken for those friends to even be friends with that paralyzed person, to be associated with that paralyzed person. It took a lot of faith just to break through that wall of suspicion and fear. Second, faith is something collective. It's something we have and do in community. That shouldn't be surprising. As we've seen already in the last few weeks, when Jesus calls his followers, he calls them into community. He doesn't change lives to leave people where they are. He invites people with those words. Follow me. Follow me. Let's do something together. We who find ourselves in the Methodist movement and this Methodist tradition find a strong emphasis there on the collective nature of faith. As Lee pointed out during last week's new members class, John Wesley chuckled at the idea that faith is something we work out on our own. Wesley famously said, in the language of his day, "Holy solitaries," that's a phrase no more consistent with the gospel than holy adulterers. The gospel of Christ knows no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness. Wesley described the Christian faith as the Christian life as faith working by love, faith working by love. So maybe he'd like the catchword of our own community of faith here, putting love into action. But that's not something we each do on our own. We can see that in the story of the friends of this paralyzed person. It may be that one of his friends got the idea to carry this guy to Jesus, but he couldn't have done that all alone. It may be that one of them got that wacky idea to climb to the roof and dig that hole, but that takes the kind of courage, frankly, the kind of nerve that we find when we're together. As Kristen put it in this week's Bible study, we are braver together. It may be that another one of his friends said, "Hey, we can lower the guy right down plop in front of this Jesus and he'll have to do something about him." But they could never have pulled that one off on their own. There was a time a few years back when Carol Scott cajoled a group of us to help stop a friend from being unjustly and illegally deported. which we did by standing in front of the vehicle trying to spirit him away in the middle of Broadway. It worked for only a very short time before we were hauled off to jail. But that brought enough attention to the situation so that ultimately we prevailed. That was nothing. Let me tell you, that was nothing that any of us had the nerve to pull off on our own. But collectively, we had the faith and the foolish courage to try something a little bit outlandish. I think that's how it was for those friends of the paralyzed person. Can you imagine, first of all, carrying their friend to a place where they knew perfectly well he was going to be shunned, and they just go along with him? And then having the nerve to take him through the roof? Amazing, just amazing, and a little bit ridiculous, you got to admit. Betty said it at Bible study this week. Everybody needs 4 friends like that, willing to be ridiculous, willing to be courageous like that. And we each need to be a friend like that to somebody. We each need to be a friend like that. So third, our faith will elicit a divine response. And that is what can move mountains. How could Jesus have failed to respond to such an amazing, outrageous, ridiculous display of faith? And respond he does in a way that, as you heard, leads him into trouble. But Jesus never shies away from trouble. Good trouble. Necessary trouble. And neither should we. All of that leads to the impossible, as we heard together. And it leads to the kind of attention that leads Jesus to more trouble. In a moment, we will welcome not 4, but 5 new friends who have found the faith and foolish courage to join our community of faith and to find faith and foolish courage here in the midst of this community. They love this church. I love this church. We love this church. But we know that the church is not really the object of our love. Rather, we know that the church has to be the instrument of God's love if it's the church. Bill Coffin used to say that the church is an institution, and I can't do Bill Coffin, but the church is an institution, and like all institutions, it tends towards a kind of conservatism. But what it needs to conserve is that uprooting, radical, and revolutionary tradition that is the gospel of Jesus Christ, who crossed every barrier, broke down every wall, went through every boundary, and still breaks through our beloved walls that separate us from each other. And still gives us, together, the faith and the foolish courage to rip through the roof, to rip through the roof. Christ has broken down the wall. Repeat after me. Christ has broken down the wall. Christ has broken down the wall. Christ has gone through the roof. And Christ has broken down the wall. Let's stand and sing together. Christ has broken down the wall.